So in thinking about what else may contribute to criminality, let's just think for a minute about some of the popular notions of what causes a criminal. Now, although this particular article is a little old now, having been published in 2002, in it we can see some relatively simplistic environmental accounts of the causes of crime. So here we see a link between bad parenting and crime. And this sentiment was echoed just last month by David Cameron, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The idea that he is currently proposing is that if you can impose parenting programs, these types of programs with the skills that they give would help prevent, amongst a range of other things, future crime. So how might family or immediate environmental influences work? Well, on a social level, we are able to draw on some of the theories we already know about. The theoretical mechanism by which this occurs is perhaps best seen in its most extreme form in social learning theory. Now, in contrast to what I've spoken about previously, social learning theorists suggest that committing crime is just a learnt response. Although we are most familiar with social learning theory in reference to Bandura and his Bobo doll, social learning theories of crime have their origins in the work of sociologist E.H. Sutherland, who developed differential association theory. Now, the theory simply suggests that criminal behaviour, just like any other behaviour, is learnt through association with others, usually in the form of close groups. In this context, the criminal or delinquent actor models and imitates the deviant behaviour of fellow group members, including their techniques, that is how to do it, and their rationalisations, or if you like, their attitudes about crime. The learning experiences, which Sutherland called differential associations, vary in frequency and importance for each individual. But for Sutherland, it was the ratio of exposure to criminal norms rather than just criminal associations which is actually important. So the theory lays considerable emphasis on the process of socialisation, and as such the theory presents a very different view of the criminal. They're not propelled to crime by genes or their personality, but rather they just learn inappropriate behaviour during the process of growing up. So social learning theory has been applied to many crimes, and one of the most recent applications has been by Fox and colleagues to stalking behaviour. Stalking can be defined as unwanted, harassing and threatening behaviour that occurs repeatedly. So it's a crime, unlike most other crimes, except perhaps sexual assault, which comprises otherwise legal behaviours. So things like repeatedly turning up uninvited, leaving gifts, constant calling and texting, behaviours like that. Collectively, these behaviours are only considered illegal when a reasonable person would consider the behaviour to be threatening, harassing and frightening. The experience of being stalked can have a big physical and psychological impact on the victim, with them experiencing anything from headaches through to suicidal thoughts. Generally, there has been a lack of research into stalking that has used theory. Social learning theory has been applied to intimate partner violence, and there is evidence that stalking is often committed in the context of intimate partner violence. Further, intimate partner violence and stalking share similarities that may make the application of social learning theory appropriate. Now, in Fox and colleagues' analysis, they applied social learning theory to try and understand both stalking perpetration and victimisation. And in our analysis, we're going to focus on perpetration. So they administered a survey to 15,000 college students, of whom 19% volunteered to participate. In the survey, they provided participants with a definition of stalking and then asked those participants questions relating to whether they'd ever engaged in stalking behaviour. Those who answered yes to 2 or more of the 11 items were classified as being a stalker. They assessed variables to operationalise the main components of social learning theory, including interpreting stalking as an unfavourable or favourable behaviour, differential reinforcement, and differential association and modelling. The sample they obtained was 59% female, 77% white, and 96% heterosexual, and relatively young with a mean age of 23 years. Of all of those who responded, 26% indicated they'd been a victim of stalking, whereas 6% indicated that they had been a stalker. So they conducted a logistic regression, and in that model they controlled for demographic variables. And overall, the model was significant. They found that differential period of association was a significant predictor of behaviour. That is, stalkers were significantly more likely to report knowing one or more friends who also engaged in stalking behaviour. Stalkers' definitions also predicted. so that stalkers also reported that they would react less negatively to friends who engaged in stalking. And they also possessed neutralising cognitions, in that they believed stalking someone was okay in some situations. The authors concluded that in relation to stalking, there are responses, attitudes and behaviours that are learned, modified or reinforced primarily through interaction with peers. So what actually predicts offending, or why do people offend? Well, as I hope is clear by now, there is not a definitive answer. But what helps in this area are longitudinal studies. And one of the most interesting contributions in this space is by David Farrington and his colleagues in the Cambridge Study of Delinquent Development. In looking as to what predicts offending, they've brought together social learning aspects with the possibility of there being genetic or biological contributions in terms of personality. And they look at this in terms of what predicts becoming criminal. So Farrington and colleagues carried out a longitudinal study of 411 working class boys born in London's East End in 1953. They were first contacted in the early 1960s when they were aged 8 to 9 years old. And now we have access to over 200 publications that follow the criminal records of these men up to the age of 56. At age 48, 94% of those who were still alive had been retained in the study. So it's an amazingly rich resource looking at this offending behaviour. So in terms of early offending, Farrington found that of his sample, 21% had a criminal conviction by the age of 16. A further 13% had convictions by age 25, and by age 40, 40% of the sample in total had convictions, and by age 56, 42% had been convicted. But while 40% were convicted at age 40 in 1993, this was also true of 28% of their fathers, 13% of their mothers, 43% of their brothers, 12% of their sisters, and 9% of their wives. So, offending tended to be concentrated in families, but with evidence both potentially of biology and social learning, with the social learning element explaining perhaps the wife's offending. Farrington and colleagues also observed that while 64% of families contained at least one convicted person, just 6% of families accounted for half of all the convictions of family members. For these chronic offenders with a large number of convictions at age 32, Farrington found warning signs that their possible future lifestyle were present at an early age. For example, they were invariably identified as troublesome and or dishonest while still at primary school. The strongest predictors of juvenile delinquency, that is offending between the age of 10 and 16, were being seen as troublesome, dishonest and daring, and having a convicted parent, a sibling with behavioural problems, and there being poor parental child rearing practices evident. In predicting convictions up to age 32, these children had been troublesome, daring and had not achieved well at school. They're also likely to have a convicted parent and a sibling with behavioural problems, to live in poor housing and to be separated. So accepting that this study is not perfect and what we are seeing are associations and not necessarily causal relationships, this study, along with many others I've presented, does seem to suggest that both genetics and social factors contribute to criminality. So how does all of this link to post-event profiling? Well, it is interesting to see that many of the profiles created after crimes have been committed seem to draw on these statistically common features of offenders. And this perhaps suggests that in some or many cases, the profile might actually have less to do with the crime scene observed and more to do with the investigator's knowledge of features statistically associated with all offending behaviour.